ready to go? All right. Set that down. All right, hi, good morning, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out on this rainy Sunday morning for our first summer book review of the season. If you're joining us at home, because we need to get the TV on real quick for the German World Cup game, we're glad that you're watching as well. So my name is Logan Faron. I'm a parishioner here, and the book that I'll be talking about today is called Chokepoints: American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. And the book is by Edward Fishman, and I really recommend it. I'm going to talk through like the main points of it here. Some of it might be a little confusing. I had to go back and reread some things. You're dealing with a lot of recent history here, a lot of important conflicts across the globe, but I found it a very fascinating book, and that's why I chose to share it for the summer book review. All right, so why did I choose it? Okay, so one thing that I liked about the book, or just the idea of economic warfare in general, is the title of the first chapter is called "Win Without Fighting." And I think that's like very important. As members of the church, like we're always looking for more peaceful solutions, and we want to mediate and avoid conflict in general, right? Because that's what we're called to do. But in addition to that, if there is going to be a conflict between nations, it's better that it's financial as opposed to violence. And I'm a middle school teacher. I spent most of my career teaching sixth graders, and I sometimes when things come up in the news, like we'll get into a discussion, and I'll say, actually, did you guys know that we live in the most peaceful time in human history? And any kid that is within earshot of this will scream, "No, no way! There's no way, Mr. Faron," right? And it's hard for them to believe because they're flooded with bad news all the time. Their social media feeds, the news in general has a bias towards negativity. But if we look further and further back in the past, we'll see that we're not in
Well, he started.
a large scale war, not in the time of world wars. You go further and further back in history. Some of the conflicts in Europe and China were horribly devastating. So overall, we are in a fairly peaceful time. And that's not to say that there's not conflicts. Obviously, you can still see what's going on in the news, in the Middle East, and in Ukraine. There's still a lot of horror out there in the world, and there's violence. And we want to do what we can to reduce that as the United States, a superpower. But a lot of times when you hear about an American response on the news, it's, well, economic sanctions have been leveled, okay? Or the Trump administration, the Biden administration is introducing economic sanctions. You hear that, and I'm not trying to put anyone on the spot, but I'll turn it to the crowd here. When you hear the word or the phrase economic sanctions, is there anything that comes to mind? Yeah, Tony.
The big example from 4 years ago is when we started hitting Russia with very bad economic sanctions for invading Ukraine and cutting them off from international sources of funds and so on.
Okay, yeah.
So not how they avoid.
Yeah. So that's part of it, right? When we think about their fund, when we think about them trying to sell a specific commodity, and And, that's what comes to mind for me, right? But the book goes into a lot of detail about what exactly do we do in response to these events, okay? And it does require, a lot of planning, by leaders in Washington DC. And a lot of the people that are kind of like the main characters in the book might work for the Treasury Department as opposed to the Department of Defense. But they might work for the, Commerce Department. And they're very influential. So I'll kind of go over some of the main parts of the book. And then if you have questions at the end, I'll do my best to address them. Again, there's a lot of technical stuff in here. And hopefully I'll do a good job. I'm not a finance person. I don't work for the Federal Reserve. I've gone into professional development, they used the Federal Reserve before. But I'm no JP Morgan. I'm just a guy that was kind of interested in the book. So we'll go ahead and, oh, one more thing. Here. You can go ahead and start. Okay. So again, as a member of the church, we kind of think like when a country goes into a conflict, whether or not we're like always like pulling up like a church doctrine about it, a lot of us probably initially kind of go back to that Augustinian or I think it's Thomas Aquinas that kind of like came up with some of the just war doctrine. And obviously different beliefs when it comes to the conflict just, but a basis for warfare in general is that if a country is going to engage in a war, it has to first have legitimate authority, right? So we've heard that phrase, state has the monopoly on violence, right? But if we think about economic warfare, right? For most of human history, until perhaps some of these cryptocurrencies were introduced, state or governments have the right to issue currency, right? And that's a power that's given to the United States federal government or the law of the Constitution.
No, I have the other thing in and it started playing.
All right. The next thing is if you're going to war, whether it's a physical or an economic case of warfare, there has to be a just cause, right? So why are we going about this? To defend innocents, to protect allies, to protect the community. I think that in the book, the actions that are taken are as a result to protect people in general. The right intention, so war shouldn't be done as a result of wrath, revenge. And we have a long history with a lot of these countries. But typically in the book, the actions that are taken are a result of like a specific event that's going on. And then just like with a regular war, if a country engages in economic war, ultimately peace needs to be the ultimate goal, right? So protect the community, but also ensure that the future is more peaceful. All right, so major events that are covered in the book, we got a pen here. The book starts in the second term of George W. Bush's administration. It moves on to the first part of the Ukraine conflict, which occurred in 2014. That's when Russia invaded the Crimea and the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. It moves on to 2018 and how the Trump administration dealt with a major Chinese telecom company starting to encroach in Europe. And you might say, okay, well, why is this like covered in the book? Well, this telecom company called Huawei is kind of seen as almost like a arm of the Chinese government. And there's a lot of surveillance technology that's included in their hardware. So if a government allows Huawei to install, cell phone technology, they found that there's like a lot of backdoors, and the Chinese government is for sure listening in if they want to. And then the book finishes up with the large scale invasion of Ukraine that started in 2022. So I don't remember this. Oop. Okay, let's go back. Okay, so early on in the book, the author kind of brings our attention to the Bosphorus Strait. So you can see Istanbul here, really a pretty picture. Anybody here on the trip? Was it like 8 years ago now, where the church sent people to Jerusalem and Istanbul? Anybody go on that? Okay, well, I would love to go. But the author kind of brings location up because it's a historical choke point, right? It's like when you think about conflicts in the past, this is an area that has been heavily fought over in a traditional war. Okay, so one of the instances that they mentioned is the Peloponnesian War. Okay, Athens versus Sparta. Greece is south of there, but even back then, trading back and forth was really important. Athens required trade with people on the Turkish peninsula in order to feed themselves. Okay, so 2,500 years ago, thereabouts, the Spartan Navy wins the victory, and Athens can't feed itself anymore, so they have to surrender and kind of ends the war. The Ottoman Turks took over Constantinople in 1453, kind of going across on the Bosphorus Strait, and then controlling that city, and then kind of fast forward a few hundred years to World War One. This is where you have the Gallipoli pact that failed Great Britain and its Commonwealth allies, again, trying to kind of push through, get to the Black Sea, and help out Russia. Ultimately, that failed. That's kind of like a historical choke point, right? People are fighting over this section of land, and success or failure or can be determined based on control. So there's been a lot of conflict here in the past, and I don't bring it up because it's unrelated. But in 2022, there was a massive fleet of Russian oil tankers that was stranded outside of the Bosphorus. So this is December 2022. And why were they there? The conflict in Ukraine had started. Okay, and we know that a major part of Russia's economy is selling oil. So they're big with oil and natural gas. And rather than a military engagement here, the United States and the European Union, they basically said, okay, in order to purchase Russian oil, we're gonna set a price cap on Russian oil. So it can be sold for $60 a barrel. And if Russia tries to sell it above that meager amount, the United States and European Union will not allow any transit of Russian oil to be carried on any vessel that originates from one of those countries. We will not allow any business to insure a Russian product here, right? So it can't be transported, can't be sold, and can't be insured. Okay, it kind of seems like small potatoes, but this did a lot of harm to the Russian economy in the war. Okay, So all this was done with just like an online post from the Treasury Department. So again, it's not this violent scene of, people trying to scale the walls of Constantinople and in the late Middle Ages here. It's, all right, really exercising power prevented, a rogue nation here from, really wielding its economic might here to help with its war, against this smaller democratic country. Okay, so this cost the Russians a lot of money. Again, it was just done with a post from the Treasury Department. Okay, and that's one thing that the United States did, but by capping the amount of money that this Russian oil could be sold for, it helped prevent them from making windfall profit. Because if people in Europe are going to buy it, maybe there's like a rush in other parts of the world where India, China would buy a whole bunch of Russian oil. So there have been past failures with economic warfare. We can think of trade embargoes. So one example might have been Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars attempting to prevent trade with Great Britain. So France tried to prevent trade with Great Britain, and it didn't work for the British controlled seas, right? And the naval power of Great Britain was too much, and that sort of trade embargo didn't work. A more recent example would be Saddam Hussein and Iraq after the First Gulf War. So the country was hit with a lot of economic sanctions because of its conduct and its attempt to gain weapons of mass destruction. What we saw is that there were bad consequences for the Iraqi people as a result of this. There were heavy sanctions. Ultimately, there was like a program passed by the United Nations called the Oil for Food Program, where they said, okay, Iraq, you can sell oil, but there has to be limits on what you're selling it for, or what you can do with that profit. And it was supposed to feed the Iraqi people, but what ended up happening is kind of in a black market situation. Saddam Hussein was able to make a lot of money from selling this oil in a more clandestine way, and the people of Iraq suffered greatly for it, and there's still a consequence to this economic warfare, right? So if you level sanctions at a country, it does have to be effective, right? This was an effective program, and we know that as a result, that infant mortality in Iraq increased a lot because of this, and ultimately the program was scrapped. So again, when we talk about economic warfare, there can still be bad consequences from it, especially if it's not done well. So it is still warfare, even if there are not soldiers on the battlefield. So what I would say is, as you read this book, you're going to find that most of the actions undertaken by the United States are ultimately somewhat or very successful. They might not deter bad actions from these other countries, and sometimes the United States response happens after, right? But you might say like, okay, well, what makes the United States so influential or so powerful that it's able to influence, all these countries worldwide? And part of it is that we're the world's reserve currency. So the United States dollar is involved in 90% of foreign transactions. So one country wants to buy and sell something with another country, those companies, those banks, are going to use dollars at some point in that transaction. So it's kind of been the case since World War II. we're not a huge exporter, right? The United States doesn't export like a ton of things, but countries all over the world use our dollars because they're so stable. And that's something that really gives the United States some power. But if you don't have access to major financial institutions in the United States, or if you don't have access to the Federal Reserve Bank, that can make things very difficult for foreign countries or companies that might not be aligned with the United States interest. So again, I think of this big number here. The dollar is used everywhere. The United States can wield it to its influence. So, all right. So the first major part of the book was talking about Iran, and it's in the second term of the George W. Bush administration. And we're getting in line from 2006, 2007. This is a very difficult time in the Middle East, 20 years ago. We know that the war in Iraq has been going on for several years. We know Iran has been heavily involved in that. At this point in time, we have the Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, remember him. So he is, he's speaking very aggressively, and especially towards Israel. He's a big proponent of an Iranian nuclear program. But the United States is not really sure how to handle this large Middle Eastern country that is, acting, more aggressively, more assertively. And what the book kind of starts with is that, like, after the September 11th attacks in the Treasury Department, there's an office called the Office of Foreign Assets Control. And they started to kind of scale up, and as a result of the war on terror, they're asserting themselves more. They're finding that they have more to do to prevent the spread of assets to terrorist groups. So in 2006 and 2007, the George W. Bush administration really isn't sure what to do with Iran. They kind of think that war might be the only option, right? We've already sanctioned Iran. We don't trade with them. There's not a lot left that we can do. So part of the way that Iran was successful, or its economy was growing and they had funding available for their nuclear program, was that although the United States didn't trade with Iran, other countries in the world did, and Europeans did as well. And as we go from 2008, 2009, the Obama administration is coming in, these employees in the Treasury Department are kind of like toying with some new ideas. And we also have Congress that is ready to be a little bit more aggressive with the economic warfare. So this is where we get some of the first ideas here. Basically saying that overseas companies, if you're doing business with Iran, so if you're a European company and you're an Asian company and you're doing business with Iran, we're going to do something called secondary sanctions. So you're not going to be able to have access to American capital. You're not going to be able to use the American dollar for these dealings with Iran. So again, because the dollar, because American financial institutions are so involved in this globalized system of buying and selling, this presented a major problem, and it was one that hadn't really been done before. And one of the laws that was passed kind of, and the United States kind of coordinate this with other countries. But basically, the idea was that, okay, if Iran is going to sell something to another country, wherever they're selling it to, Iran's money is going to stay with that other financial institution. And that money is not going to get to go back to Iran, where they might use it for, uranium enrichment or something else. The Revolutionary Guard or some of these other institutions that are, creating havoc in Iraq, or Lebanon. That money might stay in China, but that money might stay in India or Italy or somewhere else, right? And there were certain things that they couldn't purchase with it. So basically, the pressure was starting to be put on these foreign financial institutions that were not Iranian to kind of crack down on the Iranian government's money, or the state-controlled Iranian energy companies. So it really puts some additional pressure on Iran because their assets in a way are kind of frozen, where they have like very limited ability to use them in a way that could be helpful. And it said Washington wouldn't drive Iran's oil sales to zero, but his strategy would have worked to Iran close to zero access to its oil. So again, first term of the Obama administration, this is a major change. And it says that the United States had, and this is a quote from Ahmadinejad, publicly said that the United States had waged a hidden war, a very expensive war and a heavy war spread across the world. The war had succeeded in decreasing our oil sales and spending or transferring our oil money. So again, previously there wasn't a lot of control exerted because Iran's business with foreign countries was not, there was no interference really from the United States here. But once this happens, the Iranian government has much less access to what it can do with the money. So ultimately, as a result, we get the JCPOA. I forget exactly what the acronym stands for, but this is the Iran nuclear deal that was created in 2015. So as a result, the United States got some concessions from Iran. Iran would not produce highly enriched uranium that could be used for a weapon. And it said that International Atomic Energy Association inspectors would have complete access to Iranian facilities. So again, this work of trying to stop the spread of a nuclear weapon, the additional sanctions really brought Iran to the table here. And then as a result, Iran would receive relief from oil sanctions. So it was money that got frozen overseas. They would have more access to that. It's not all at once here, but they do get more access. And then there would be an end to conventional weapons embargo after about 5 years. So as a result here, the United States has a goal of limiting, nuclear proliferation. You don't want Iran to get a weapon, and the economic sanctions were, you would say, effective at that. So again, war as a result, but Iran's economy did suffer as a result. There's a lot of inflation, there's a lot of problems, but still it brought these two countries together without bombing, without a traditional warfare going on. This is what we got. Now, we all know how this has ended up, right? But for a while, the economic pressure resulted in this deal. The next thing I'll talk about is the Russia and Ukraine war. So this is kind of like a timeline. We got a cause and effect here. So in 2014, we had the Russian invasion of Crimea, the eastern part of Ukraine. As a result, the United States targeted smaller Russian banks and oil partnerships, okay? So Russia is a bit different from Ukraine in the sense that they're much larger, they're wealthier, and they're much more connected with American allies. So there's always a risk of, like a bad economic contagion based on what we would do, in response to Russian aggression. So in 2014, we kind of go after a smaller part of Ukraine. There's a more limited American response. Is there a response? For sure. Um, uh, but then in 2022, with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and trying to annex the entire country, the United States is going to do a lot more to target Russian oil exports. And we're gonna need to have like a lot of support from our allies. Again, if you kind of read this book, the European Union is, you know, some members are more hesitant than others, at certain points, but you kind of walk away from reading this like, hey, you know, you have like an international coalition together. There's a lot that, you know, countries can do when it comes to, you know, some of these more hostile nations. So initially, the United States levied some sanctions on Russian banks, and the Obama administration didn't go after the largest Russian banks because there's fear of, right, there's going to be a big economic downturn as a result. There's kind of like a funny statement where, you know, like an unnamed Treasury official says, make a Star Wars reference. This would be like the Death Star blowing up Captain, right? So it's not like the biggest influential banks in the Russian economy, but it's not nothing. Okay, but with some of these actions, and so capital controls against the Russian central bank, in 2014, it says, for everyday Russian deal of December 2014 and its aftermath were a lot more painful than the 2008 financial crisis. In Russia, real incomes were down by roughly 10%, right? So if you remember the 2008 crisis, that there were a lot of really bad effects in the United States. So, you know, when we think about 2014, like, you know, how much did the United States really trying to do to hurt the Russian economy for this aggression? You know, this is not nothing. And we kind of think like, well, what, you know, what could the United States have done to prevent, you know, this future full-scale attack on Ukraine? Yeah, I don't know for sure. I don't know if there's, you know, it's a whole other book review. It's a whole other thing that we could study. But you know, was this war preventable? You know, maybe not. Did Putin always kind of see himself as, you know, reasserting Russian influence and Russian control? Maybe, right? Like that could have very well been the case. But, you know, there were some actions taken as a result. So, and then
Can I say briefly about your point?
sure, you know, Tony, and then in 2016, nothing happened. Nothing, no. So, but go ahead.
Okay, before Russia invaded Ukraine, the Russian Novosti press agency had Russian government documents that were created months ahead of the war that said that the intention was genocide. And see, if the intention is genocide, economic sanctions are not going to stop that. You have a megalomaniac, to use polite language, that wants to make a genocide, and that's the goal. I don't see how any economic sanctions can stop that.
It is true, right? It's fair that all right, our economic sanctions might not be able to stop it. And we kind of entered like a grim phase of the Russian-Ukrainian war this week, where I saw on the news that this is now lasting longer than World War I, right? So, we know that Russia has done some pretty horrible things to the Ukrainians before in the 1930s. Causing famine there, causing a lot of deaths. So are economic sanctions capable of preventing war? It's a good question, right? Like, I think that in this book, we kind of see a lot of like cause and effect, where the cause is trying to acquire a nuclear weapon or trying to take territory from a neighboring state. But the effect is the sanctions coming after. But again, we also don't know, you know, how has the overall American embargo against Iran since 1979, is that prevented them from exerting their power in other ways that might have happened, right? Now, there's another intermittent situation with Iran and Iraq war of the 1980s, right? But we don't know what we don't know. There's a lot of what ifs, right? You know, what else would happen if, you know, we didn't have the particular sanctions that we have against North Korea or other, you know, kind of rogue nations, right? So it's a good question, but yeah, it didn't end up helping. And I'll kind of put these two parts together. So when Russia has its invasion of Ukraine in 2002, the Biden administration is there, and they really want to, you know, do what they can to help Ukraine. And you know, in the 2020 election, book refers to this, right? But in the 2020 election, Biden goes after Trump, you know, and it's not a verbatim quote, but basically saying, hey, you're Putin's lackey, right? You're just doing whatever he wants, right? So we know that the Biden administration, one, you know, came into office very upset with the previous administration and how they treated Russia, and how Russia interfered with the 2016 presidential election here. We have a president that wasn't, you know, going to commit to, you know, American boots on the ground. We do a lot to help the Ukrainians. But again, in 2022, when this war started, inflation is a huge problem in the United States, right? So we're coming out of COVID, right? There's still a lot of relief money out there. Inflation is going up to 8%, something that, you know, the amount of inflation was really like at its worst level since the 1980s, right? It's like Paul Volcker started the Reagan administration. If you go like a decade earlier with the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East, right? So this is a really tough time with inflationary pressures, right? And the Biden administration is very focused on that. But one thing that we know is that if gas becomes more expensive, if fuel becomes more expensive, it adds fuel to the fire when it comes to inflation, right? So Biden administration can say, all right, we have to be careful about how we go about going against Russia, because their economy is really based around oil and gas, but two, we don't want to make inflation worse in the United States. We don't want to hurt our European allies, because we're going to need their help protecting Ukraine. We have to really be smart about this. Oil is fungible, right? The Russians can sell it, China, India, they can sell it to European countries, they can sell it to South America, right? So it can really be sold in lots of places here. So they have to be smart about it. So one of the things that the United States did was they targeted Russia's central bank. They said Russia's reserve assets would be immobilized if they were going to be used to evade some of the sanctions that the United States used. So what does that mean? Well, Russia's central bank couldn't use an American electronic transfer system called SWIFT, right? So, central banks have a lot of important economic jobs, but it would basically cut the Russian central bank out of making transactions that were done by the United States. This was a big step. Biden consulted with his Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen on this, and she was pretty wary about this. She said, like, all right, let's, going after private businesses, going after oil companies, this is one thing, but, this is a pretty big step against a very large country's central bank. So there was some debate about that. Initially, European countries got on board, and did a lot to reduce their consumption of Russian oil. But initially, early on in the conflict, Russia was able to do just fine because they found other markets in Asia. So they started selling their oil to India. In India, if you kind of looked at their country, they were kind of neutral-ish in terms of the conflict. There were some people in India that were against the Russian invasion, some, not bothered by it. But a lot of Indian companies, bought up Russian oil and started the conflict. So, the Europeans, didn't provide the market access, but the Russians were able to find somebody else to pick it up. But ultimately, this decision here, where after a lot of deliberation in the White House, a lot of deliberation with European partners, we get the system of, okay, the United States is not going to buy Russian oil, the EU, we're seeing boycotts there, but we'll do a few things that we're going to prevent economic blowback or economic problems from traveling into Europe here. We're going to let the Russians sell their oil, but it's got to be a price cap. So it's going to be at that $60 a barrel level, which is pretty low. And then you're not going to have access to, Western shipping. You're not going to have access to Western insurance. You don't go by this. There's something kind of funny in the book where, you're having a discussion with counterparts in India, right? So India is starting to buy all of this Russian oil. There's some question, right? Like, are they going to go by this? Are they going to kind of get on board with what we're trying to do? And basically they said, yeah, we'll do this. With one, there's going to be a price cap on what we're buying here, but two, like, if it's Russian insurance, if it's, anything dealing with the Russian legal system, Russia's really not known for its strong rule of law here. So we think we might be out on a lot of money if there's any issues here. So they got on board with it, and this was helpful when it comes to, slowing down the Russian economy. And it's not something that, like, when we think about sanctions here, right? All right, maybe the war starts the next day, everybody in Europe decides not to buy oil, right? Hey, like, in a world market, that might cause more problems than you're anticipating, or you don't want, European countries like France and Germany and Great Britain to go into an economic depression when you need their help, fighting or supplying Ukraine. So you need your allies in a strong position as well. The last part of the book here that I'll talk about is China and Huawei. So Huawei is a Chinese telecom company, and the book says that Huawei was a private Chinese tech company, but it served as a de facto arm of the Chinese government and an executor of Beijing's geopolitical agenda. So a lot of its higher ups and CEOs came from the People's Liberation Army of China, with very close ties with the Chinese government. And then one of the quotes here was, US officials feared that the spread of Huawei equipment could one day enable Beijing to disrupt its enemies' economies and military operations from afar. So several years ago, China announced something called the Belt and Road Initiative, where they were going to engage in a lot of construction projects, mostly in the development, but in other places as well. And Huawei might provide infrastructure, and maybe 5G, internet, cell phone connections here. And one thing that the United States found was when they would build these things, they would be able to have a backdoor in the money, send all that information back to the intelligence agency in Beijing or the People's Liberation. And the example that I gave here was the African Union had an office in Ethiopia, and as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, China installed cell phone technology there, the towers, the telecom equipment powered by Huawei. And for 5 years, everything that was said, everything that was transmitted in that building went right to Beijing. So all of the details of what's going on in Africa went right back to the country, or right back to China. Now, where it gets interesting here is that the book kind of starts the chapter on this when Great Britain says, we're going to allow Huawei to build in our country. We want them to help facilitate our cell phone tower upgrade or telecom capability with 5G. And this is during the first Trump administration, and this sets off a big alarm, right? Because we do not want, one of our best allies using this equipment. And if the British go around, the rest of Europe would go as well, right? So we can kind of see some of the events here that we'll talk about. So there is another Chinese telecom company called CTE. This is a major international or major business news story where that company got a huge billion-dollar fine as a result of violating some of the Iran sanctions in 2018. So we know that some of these companies are generally, trying to get around their sanctions or, capable of in moving around these things. The main part of this chapter is Britain announcing that they're going to make a deal with them. And the Trump administration and some of the officials in Treasury, the National Security Agency, really pushing to prevent that from happening. Now, when this happens, it's not underway immediately, but in 2020, we have a lot of people kind of like stepping up. So there's a very famous speech that Nancy Pelosi made during some international travel, really calling out the Chinese government as a force for autocracy and limiting people's individual freedoms. And really saying that, hey, what, we have on this issue, like, yeah, I agree with the Trump administration that, we need to get tougher on China. We can't allow this type of big expansion. It's gonna hurt the freedoms of people worldwide. We start to see some more coordination with the European Union, where, okay, if we are not going to buy from Huawei, like, we need to find another answer. We need to, kind of do this together. And then there's a Trump national security advisor who's going to say, like, what we really need to do here is push that, we're not going to allow American firms to sell parts to Huawei that can be used for the manufacturer. We're not going to get involved in their supply chain, and we don't want our allies to do this as well. Now, this doesn't mean that the company has like disappeared. They're still a massive company, but their foothold in Europe doesn't take shape here, right? So they don't end up building in Great Britain, and part of it is all of these things kind of happening. There's also that crackdown in Hong Kong that was happening at the time. And, we know that because it was once part of the British Empire, a lot of people in Great Britain had strong feelings about what was going on there and seeing people in Hong Kong lose those freedoms. So, all of these things kind of coming together in a unified American push, like a strong action by Trump administration officials here. They get together and they say, all right, we're gonna not allow these parts from the United States to go and get sold to this country. So what happens in 2021, the company's revenue declined by 28%. So there is a major effect there, right? The United States, presented the case that, hey, you know what? They're going to be spying, right? They include backdoors. Yeah, you go against the Chinese government, they might find a way to shut down this equipment, right? So pretty unified front. Yes.
Yeah, but the question I have is how much of this was being pushed by our Silicon Valley people that were seeing a loss in their markets? And, is all of this security issue just an excuse for American firms to sell their stuff instead?
That's a really good question. That's something that if you address in the book, so, well, obviously the United States will benefit from, some potential market share opening up, but while one of Huawei's biggest competitors is Samsung. So they're competing more in Samsung than they might in Apple, I guess, if that makes sense. So there wasn't, the book didn't talk a lot about Silicon Valley and lobbying, and part of it, what would be interesting if they could add this in is, well, how was Huawei able to fill this gap, right? Why are they the ones that were able to kind of like entice Europe, or how did they get so successful that they could be the provider for Great Britain if they were seriously considered that. And I don't it's good. But the combination of those things did kind of close that. Now, again, the company is still very large, very successful, but in the short term, would you see an effect from the United States within the supply chain? Yeah.
On all these sanctions that he presents in there, does he try to, as well as tracking, how effective it is on the target's economy, does he track how much is reflected back on our economy by losing markets or changing?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I would say is So in the case of Iran, you know, we've not traded with them since 1979, so. We, you know, is the United States economy affected by Iranian sanctions? Not so much. Now, one of the interesting things though was, you know, one potential thing that they were worried about was Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, right? And that was something that was mentioned, well, we do this, close the Strait of Hormuz. And I think ultimately, and we don't know what the Iranian government's discussions were on this, but ultimately they may have decided that it would be more beneficial for them to have limited purchasing power with their oil sales as opposed to maybe shutting down the strait in the long term, or that wasn't the part they were going to play in. With Russia, sorry, yeah, follow.
But I was gonna say, you know, with all of these, you know, oil has been a major part of what they're restricting to the target company, but that reflects on worldwide pricing and reflects back on our economy. So
Yeah.
I know that it does have an effect.
Yeah. I think in the section on Iran, there was concern that, okay, we are, you know, these things are kind of heating up, 2010, 2011, 2012, there's more and more restrictions. I think what, they did talk about concerns by the Obama administration. Okay, we're like finally coming out of the Great Recession, if like we spike oil prices in a big way, that could really hurt the recovery. But what we found was that, like in those chapters, they spent some time talking about Congress was really pushing for these things. You had like big, like almost unanimous votes to increase these sanctions on Iran, and the Obama administration kind of trying to figure out, okay, well, you know, the people that demanded this, right? And they were on board with it. They also had to kind of figure out, like, how can we do this in a way that, you know, how can we enforce this law in a way that doesn't hurt the United States as much. In the Russia chapter, the biggest concern is about Europe immediately, right? And obviously we know that it's a worldwide market, but again, the oil did keep flowing, right? Like sales continued, but you know, again, it does create a lot of problems for Russian business and Russian government. Okay. With China, you know, again, this is still a mess.
It didn't, do various expressions about that, what are some of the, officials and some of the Chinese companies, I don't remember if it's Huawei or some of the related ones, actually, arrest some of the CEOs and what?
Yeah, so it was the ZTE company. And it was, maybe it was the daughter of the founder. She lived in Vancouver and she was arrested by Canadian police. She was held in house arrest. I don't know what the ultimate resolution was of that, but President Xi made like a strong push, you know, to Trump to kind of like, hey, this is a really important person here. I don't know, it's, well, these charges are baseless, or I can't believe what you're treating her. So, you know, she was booked and then put out of house arrest and some like $1 million, separate multi-million dollar pension in Vancouver. Right, but there wasn't enough. You know, as we kind of wrap up here, we see that, right, access to American technology could be fairly effective. as well, in addition to that. So, thank you for coming out. If you have any extra questions, let me know, I'll be happy to run with it.
My understanding is that World War II, particularly in the case of both Japan and Germany, was precipitated precisely because of economic sanctions. So that, you know, a lot of times, two factors, economic sanctions often, like out and out war, impact the poor and the powerless, and more than anybody else. And second of all, they often precipitate an escalation, which results in bombing Pearl Harbor, or other actions in the invasion of Poland. Does this book address any of that? That, economic sanctions are often just the preface for World War.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think, so the book doesn't spend a lot of time on like, all right, how do we know like this won't fire out of control here? What I will say, like just my thought, like after having read this and general World War II knowledge, we don't see an all-out embargo, right? Or a complete prevention of buying and selling, right? So, do these things hurt regular people or people absolutely, right? So in the Iran chapter, they talk about after some of these sanctions, they're talking regular Iranian people were talking about, do you make enough for chicken, right? So we're going to celebrate Eid at the end of Ramadan here. Does your family have enough for chicken this year? You're going to have to eat something else. That was kind of like a popular thing online, right? Now, it wasn't an all-out embargo, right? So it wasn't like we put a stopper in all of Iran's ability to buy and sell. They're still able to sell their oil and make money from it, but it didn't hurt their economy. Whereas like in World War II, based on Japan's atrocities in China, the United States said, okay, embargo, we're not going to sell you anything, right? And you're right, that could have been what directly led to Pearl Harbor, right? So I think it doesn't mean that there's no danger of it escalating. I think an embargo is like another step further, right? But when it comes to sanctions, it is a middle, right? So like I can read this book and I can say, all right, you know what? We stopped like nuclear proliferation in Iran for a while. Unfortunately, we pull out of the agreement. Now there's the conflict there. But they're like in 2013, the Iranians selected four of the reformist leaders, then Ahmadinejad, right? So like the needle did move, and there wasn't an outright conflict, right? You can kind of see like, there's other actors in the book where like, the United States Congress is pushing for Iran, like heavier and heavier Iran sanctions. The Obama administration said, okay, well, all right, we can try and make this work, right? Netanyahu is the leader of Israel at this point. He's like, right, we're missing our window, right? We need to do a military attack on their facility, right? This is 15 years ago, right? So, there are different pressures here, right? Like it is still economic warfare, but as opposed to the alternative, right? We hear that, right? Like if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will, right? And there's still goods crossing borders as a result of these actions, but maybe it's not, as lethal, so. And, all right, well, please come back next week, we've got Dr. John Gold for our next installment, you won't want to miss it. Thanks. Thank you.